the 1 or 2 college courses that they're required to take the first semester. It's a bit of a jump, I think, for any freshman in high school to be like, oh, wait.
But I feel like it's just like being a teacher, where that first semester you're really underwater, and then every semester it gets a expectations.
Stephanie, was that freeze glitch on my end or overall?
No, I think it's overall. I was just wondering if it was mine.
Okay.
I think.
Well, it happened 2 seconds after we connected to Facebook, so.
I know, yes. That's why I was like, I think that might be me, but I'm not sure if it is. All right. I think we've got everybody up and running, and we are on Facebook. So I have got right at 12:15. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Once again, I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on FBAs and BIPs that actually work. My name is Stephanie McLaughlin, and I'm the Training and Evaluation Specialist with Partners Resource Network. Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates the Texas statewide network of parent training and information centers. We are funded through the Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. We have 4 projects throughout Texas that are known as PACT, PATH, and TEAM. And our mission at Partners Resource Network is to empower and support Texas families and individuals impacted by disabilities or special healthcare needs. Also joining us today from Partners Resource Network is our Director of Statewide Services, Christina Henning, our Support Specialist, Chelsea Rivas, and our Technology Specialist, Zach Hidalgo. If you're having any technical difficulties today, please reach out to Zach in the chat box, and he will assist you with those. For those of you that are needing a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, you will be receiving a thank you email for joining the webinar today. If you'll follow the link in that email, you can get your certificate of attendance. We will have a time for question and answers at the end of today's presentation. If you're joining us on Zoom, please put all of your questions for Dr. Hart in the Q&A box. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can type those in the comments and we'll get them from there. We are recording today's webinar, and the recording will be available on our website at prntexas.org, as well as our Facebook page. So I'd like to go ahead and get us to today's presentation. So our presenter today is Dr. Stephanie Hart. Dr. Hart is an assistant professor of special education at West Texas A&M University. Dr. Hart teaches in the education preparation and educational diagnostician programs, including courses in classroom and behavior management, low incidence disabilities, collaboration, adolescence, and transition. Dr. Hart is on the planning committee and advisory board at the WTAMU Center for Learning Disabilities. Additionally, she serves as an adjunct faculty member at Texas Tech University, where she teaches graduate courses in an approved BCBA preparation program. Dr. Hart has provided teacher coaching and behavior management to school districts across the Panhandle and parent training via teleconsultation to families of children with autism spectrum disorder. She also provides support to community organizations, including the JT and Margaret Talkington YWCA, the Turn Center, and the Burkhart Center for Autism Education and Research. Dr. Hart's research interests include autism, applied behavior analysis, observational assessment, and single subject design. She has conducted research in a variety of school-based settings from pre-K all the way to the university level. Dr. Hart, we're so glad to have you today, and we welcome you here. And I'm going to stop sharing and allow you to share and turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Stephanie. I am very excited to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and then I'll get started. All right. There's always that awkward moment as you transition to the slide sharing, but it is nice to see someone's face for a minute first.
Yes.
All right, I know you can see a lot of things. Just give me a second. All right, can you see my opening slide?
We can. That looks perfect.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you all so much for having me. So we're going to talk about FBAs and BIPs that actually work today. It's a complicated process, and I want to tell you a little bit about the perspective of where this is coming from for this particular presentation. So you'll see after my name some letters. One of them is EDD, that's a doctorate, and another one is a BCBA-D. So that means that I'm a board certified behavior analyst, and I study the science of behavior. So the science of behavior is called applied behavior analysis, and it really focuses on how we get to effective behavior change. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about FBAs and BIPs from a behavioral perspective. We can talk about them from many perspectives. There's certainly a compliance perspective of what the law requires us to do with FBA and BIPs. There's this interpersonal perspective, and collaboration perspective. You're involving the teacher, you're involving the parents, you're involving other school professionals. So there's this collaboration aspect. And then there's also a behavioral aspect, and that's what we're talking about today. So we're going to be talking about best practices from a behavioral perspective so that your functional behavior assessment yields really significant results that then helps you pick good interventions in your behavior intervention plans. If we have good sound interventions and we're really tracking them in a systematic way, then that's the best way to end up with some significant behavior change. All right, so here are the 5 things we're going to discuss in this session. So we're going to discuss how to come to consensus about the problem behavior. And all of these stars really have to do with across the IEP team or across the ARD team, depending on how your district might call them. So how to come to consensus about the problem behavior, how to use the FBA to choose interventions that will actually improve the behavior, how to ensure that intervention is reasonable for the teacher to implement long-term, how to make a plan to share and receive updates on how the intervention is working, and how to periodically follow up with the teacher about accommodations recommended in the IEP. And I picked these 5 things to talk about because these are not only really best practice steps for the functional behavior assessment to behavioral intervention plan process, but they're really best practice in terms of how do we change behavior effectively. All right, so this is just a quick overview. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with these terms. So these are the 3 tools that we're going to be using today, FBA, BIP, and IEP. And of course, if you're new to special education, you're probably going to be drowning in all of these acronyms. But just as a refresher, so when we have a student who is in special education and has a behavior challenge or a behavior problem, we can't just put goals for behavior straight into the IEP, that gray step. We have to start from the FBA step and flow through. So the first tool that you would use is FBA, a functional behavior assessment. We use it to really dig deep into a high priority problem behavior. Usually you're tracking one problem behavior at a time in your FBA. And then what makes it work, and really what the purpose of it is to determine the purpose or function of that problem behavior. Once you have the purpose or function of the problem behavior, then you use the results from the functional behavior assessment to develop the BIP, the behavior intervention plan. So it's developed from the results from the FBA. And what really makes it work is if you're using function-based interventions and evidence-based strategies. And we're going to talk more about that. And then lastly, once you have determined the function of the problem behavior and then developed some function-based intervention using evidence-based strategies, then that goes into the IEP. So our individualized education plan. And that's made up of academic goals and behavioral goals. Academic goals come from all your various assessments, and behavioral goals come from that FBA to BIP process. Okay, so let's start first with recommendations to make the most of a functional behavior assessment. So here are two things we're going to discuss about functional behavior assessments. The importance of coming to consensus about the problem behavior, and how to use the FBA to choose interventions that will actually improve behavior. So let's talk about this first one, coming to consensus about the problem behavior. We're going to talk about our student Jane. And even though there are lots of perspectives and lots of different voices coming to the table during ARD meetings, the overarching goal is Jane's academic progress. That is the intention of the Department of Education and of all of our special education laws. That's the intention when they wrote these laws, so that you could be able to have Jane in the most successful academic track that she could be in. So it's really important to keep in mind that Jane's academic progress is our end goal. And so we want to prioritize target behaviors that have the biggest impact on Jane's educational progress. And this is where sometimes our teams get a little bogged down. Sometimes you hear things like, well, she's disturbing the classroom, or she's disrupting other students' learning. That's very true. I was a classroom teacher in general education as my first teaching job. And I understand that very well. Disturbing the classroom and disrupting other students' learning is a very valuable concern and a very valid concern by the general education teacher and the special education teacher as well. But what we need to think about is coming to consensus about a problem behavior that focuses on Jane's academic progress. So if we're choosing a behavior to track in our functional behavior assessment, and the goal of that behavior is to reduce disturbances, reduce outbursts, reduce things that impact others' learning, that's not actually a goal about Jane. And it's not really a goal that's going to increase Jane's academic progress. And that doesn't mean we can't address it. It just means that if we want the end goal to be Jane's academic progress, we have to start with academic progress first. So instead of thinking about it in terms of what is the biggest problem is that Jane's behavior disturbs the classroom and disrupts other students' learning. We need to think about it and put Jane back in the center and think about what is the problem behavior in terms of Jane. And so it may be that the problem behavior is you need to increase the amount of time that Jane spends on completing academic activities. That would be an academic goal for Jane. We might say that we want to decrease the problem behaviors that happen around Jane's academic learning and increase the amount of time she spends engaging in academic activities. That's also about Jane. So it's really thinking about how do we spin it so that we put Jane back in the middle. If we're putting Jane back in the middle, then that serves two goals. One, we're meeting our overarching goal of working on Jane's academic progress. But two, and really maybe even the most importantly, if Jane is more engaged, and if Jane is receiving appropriate instruction on her level, where she's not getting frustrated as often, those other problems will reduce. The disturbances to the classroom, the disturbances to other behaviors learning, if Jane is getting what she needs academically, those other problems are going to get better by default. So the point here is that we don't start with the disruption, but if we really choose a very important goal for Jane, we can really meet two needs. We can increase her academic progress and reduce some of the disruption as a secondary impact that are disrupting other students. And so that's really where we get to the F part of functional behavior assessment. So I would encourage everybody to remember that behavior is communicating a need. It's communicating something that the student needs or wants. It's not because they want to disturb other people or because they want to be a bother. I don't think that's a reasonable interpretation of behavior. Behavior communicates something. And there are different choices of what behavior can communicate, but in a classroom, it most often means one of two things. The behavior is either communicating that the student needs attention, and the student is using the behavior to communicate that they need attention, or they're using their behavior to communicate a frustration with the level of instruction they're getting. And oftentimes that means that the level of instruction and the expectations for them is not a good match to their current skill level. So one last thing I'll say before we move on from number one is that generally the functional behavior assessment focuses on a single problem behavior. Spending some time in an ARD meeting or spending some time with the IEP team on coming to consensus is really important. Many of these are group discussion based tools. And so when schools get overwhelmed, a lot of times there are side conversations, or you might discuss something and then you come into the ARD meeting and finalize it. I understand the purpose for that, especially when you have a lot of students that have IEPs and need ARD meetings. But I really encourage everybody to use some of that ARD meeting time for discussion and for consensus. It's not really consensus if it's predetermined and then just presented to the parent and to the rest of the team. Okay, so the next step in our FBA best practice recommendations is to use the FBA to choose interventions that will actually improve the behavior. So going back to the F, this is function. Function-based is the key. We have to determine, in number one, we're determining what problem behavior are we going to tackle. In number two, we're really looking at what is the function or purpose of the problem behavior. And then you're choosing an intervention that matches that same need. And that's why we had in the beginning under FBA and BIP as well, that we're looking at function-based interventions that are specifically chosen to address that communication need. And it's generally attention or needing a variation or some modified instruction. So function-based is the key. It needs to be an intervention that can definitely impact the problem behavior that was identified through consensus in step number one. Another thing to think about is can't versus won't. So this is not usually an attention-based problem. This is when we're talking about a mismatch of instruction between what the student is getting and what they're capable of doing. And it's really important to think of can't versus won't. Is it that the student can't do what you're asking them to do, or they won't do what you're asking them to do? Those are two very different functions, and you're going to choose an intervention that matches that function. For instance, if they won't do what you want them to do, that means they're fully capable of doing the work that you want them to do. And you have evidence for that. You've seen them do it. You have many times where they have been able to do it. And sometimes what won't looks like is a situation where sometimes they will do it and sometimes they won't. If that is the situation, then that's when really general motivation and reinforcement can be a really strong intervention. If the student can't do it, that means that they're not able to perform or complete the work on the level that it's currently being presented to them. If they can't do it, then we're looking at that next step. We're looking at skill building versus reinforcement. If they won't do it, but they have done it before, you can go with reinforcement. If they can't do it, they don't have the ability to do it currently at the level, then really the intervention needs to focus on skill building. So for an example, a student that's constantly disrupting class by calling out or making noises, then there may be some skill building needs there. You may need to teach the student, how do you get the teacher's attention appropriately? How do you appropriately tell the teacher that you're not understanding? And some of our students that are a little bit more severe and are maybe more on the nonverbal range, how do they let the teacher know that they need help or attention without throwing materials or screaming? There are other ways that we want them to let us know that they need us. We want them to raise their hand, or we might want them to give us a card that says help, depending on the level of your student. So most of the time, I'm finding that in functional behavior assessments, most of the time the problem is can't. And because the problem is can't, then you need to go to skill building. Sometimes the problem is won't, and you can go with more straightforward reinforcement, but most of the time it's can't. There's a mismatch between instruction and the student's present level of functioning. And then that's why I have this last note at the bottom, that sticker charts are not a universal tool. If you think back to what we just talked about, sticker charts are a reinforcement system. You are rewarding someone for doing something that they already know how to do. You just want to increase the times that they actually do it. So that goes with won't, and it goes with reinforcement. They can do it, and you have seen them do it, but sometimes they choose not to. Then you can go a more straight up motivational reinforcement route, and you can use a sticker chart. I do find teachers very, very often using sticker charts for skill building skills. Just as a very crude example, let's say I pick a language that's spoken on the other side of the world that I have no experience with. Let's say Mandarin. If I needed to speak Mandarin, I would absolutely need skill building, and I would need systematic skill building from the bottom up. It doesn't matter how much you try to reward me or reinforce me, I will not be able to speak Mandarin without skill building. Sticker charts and reinforcement and token economies are not going to help if it's a skill that I just don't possess. So that's just something to think about. We often think about rewarding, and that doesn't mean that skill building strategies don't involve reinforcement, but they have to involve skill building as well. Okay, so now we're moving on to our second tool, which is making the most of behavior intervention plans. So we're starting at number 3 here, and that because that shows you that steps 1 and 2 feed into this behavior intervention plan step. So we're going to talk about 2 things here: ensuring that intervention is reasonable for the teacher to implement long-term, and making a plan to share and receive updates on how the intervention is working. Okay, so let's talk about this first one, making sure that the intervention is reasonable. Again, from a behavioral perspective, one of the reasons why interventions fail is that they're actually not built on a solid foundation to begin with. It may be that you determined the function correctly and you picked a function-based intervention, but it has to be reasonable typically for the classroom teacher to be able to implement it long-term. If it's not reasonable for the teacher to implement long-term, it's not going to work for very long. So here are some things from a behavioral perspective that you'll want to keep in mind. How long will the behavior be measured, and by whom? Many, many times, and I certainly experienced this when I was a classroom teacher, if I needed assistance, someone would come into my classroom, do a couple of brief observations, make a recommendation as to how I should be intervening with a student, and then leave. And we really didn't talk about, okay, how are we measuring the behavior? Who is measuring the behavior? The classroom teacher is implementing the intervention. Is the classroom teacher also measuring the behavior, measuring progress? And how is that happening? Is it happening through just a very simple frequency count or tallies of when it's happening? If a specialist is coming into the class to measure the behavior that the teacher is intervening upon, how often is that behavior specialist going to come in and measure the behavior? If the behavior specialist is only coming in once or twice to measure the behavior, then after that, the teacher will still be implementing the intervention, but we won't really know if the behavior is improving because the measurement part has been lost. So that's something to plan ahead. Who will be measuring the behavior and how? And then the next thing to think about, all of this needs to be planned ahead, is how many minutes or days or sessions that the intervention will take place before you can expect results. If I am sick and I go to the doctor and the doctor says, you have an infection, you need to take antibiotics, I want to know, okay, how many days should I take this antibiotic before I start to feel a little better? On the flip side, how many days should I take this antibiotic before I should be feeling better, but I'm not? And then I can call back and say, okay, the antibiotic you chose is not working. So it's not that you need to have a crystal ball and pick an exact day that you're going to see progress, but you should have a pretty good sense of how long the intervention will take before you start to see results. And again, if we go back to skill building, if you are encouraging me to speak Mandarin, I know there are many steps that are going to happen before I can speak Mandarin. And that's where that classroom teacher really shines, because our classroom teachers are very good at understanding how to systematically build up someone's skills. But I think there needs to be a very open and reasonable discussion in that ARD meeting to say, okay, how long is this going to take? How many small milestones will this take before we really see progress? And again, for progress, we're talking about Jane's academic progress. Hopefully along the way, some of the other behavior problems will take care of themselves, but we're talking about Jane's academic progress. We're not talking about how long is it until Jane stops interrupting the class. And then the last thing I have to say about behavior intervention plans is that the classroom teacher, and this is typically the general education teacher, is the best judge of feasibility in their classroom. They're the ones in the classroom every day. They're the ones that really understand what it means to do an intervention in class and how many other students they have to deal with. So as a classroom teacher, I was not necessarily prepared to do this, but those classroom teachers should really advocate for themselves and speak up, and they should be able to ask for as much clarification and assistance as needed. So for example, if you are implementing a skill building intervention, combining this with some of our measurement, that teacher, it's very reasonable for the classroom teacher to say, okay, what behavior are we talking about? Great. Is it going to be measured? Who's going to be measuring it? Let me think about if I can really implement this intervention. And I think that the teacher can always implement it, but it's really a matter of, can they implement it as they're doing their teaching? So for example, if the intervention requires 5 straight minutes of one-on-one work with the target student, the student with Jane, that's 5 minutes that teacher is not teaching the class. Is that reasonable? How many times a day does that need to occur? If it needs to occur a couple times a day, the teacher could certainly arrange activities so that the rest of the class, perhaps the teacher might arrange it this way. The teacher teaches a 10 to 12 minute mini lesson on a math concept. Then the students in the class work independently on a math assignment for the next 10 to 15 minutes. That frees up that teacher's time to work one-on-one with Jane if she needs it. Now, we said the students might be working independently for 15 minutes. That doesn't free up the teacher for 15 minutes with Jane, because as we know, that teacher needs to be circulating to all those students to make sure they're on task, and also to make sure that those students are understanding the lesson. So really, if the students are working independently 15 minutes, we're talking about at most 5 minutes to spend with Jane. And math is really only taught once a day. So even though 5 minutes may seem like a very small amount of time, we always need to think about it from the classroom teacher's eyes. If the teacher is working with Jane, what are the other students doing? And then another piece for our behavioral intervention plan is to really think about, how do you make a plan to share and receive updates on how the intervention is working? So these are some questions that the ARD team will want to talk about, come to consensus on, and document. So how long will the teacher continue the intervention? Usually what I find, if a behavior is severe enough that you need to conduct a functional behavior assessment and ultimately put behavioral goals into the IEP, that's not going to be a quick fix. If it were a quick fix, our classroom teachers would have already fixed that problem. It usually is something that requires a little more digging, which is why we look into the function or the purpose. It also means that the intervention will last a little longer and maybe have some mile markers or some tiers of success. So we need to reasonably think about, as a team, how long do we think this teacher is going to need to do the intervention? Is it 6 weeks? Is it 9 weeks? Is it a whole semester? That's something we want to think about. And one thing I didn't put here that I definitely would add is, when will the intervention end? How will we know when it's time to fade the intervention? I guess we do have that there. So how long will it take the teacher to do the intervention? And then just as important is the second bullet point. How do we measure behavior change and increased academic success? How will we measure this? And this goes back to our previous bullet points. Who is measuring it? And how often will it be measured? So that's something to think about. The classroom teacher is generally implementing the intervention. Who's going to be measuring it? If it's a behavior specialist, do they have the time to commit to coming back into that classroom, let's say once a week for 6 to 12 weeks? That's a big commitment on both the teacher side and the behavior specialist who may be measuring it. But if we find that we get to a point where no one is measuring the problem behavior, then we don't really know if we're continuing to see results. And we also can't see the positive impact on academic success. And we also can't see the impact on those secondary disruptions that might interrupt other students' learning. So it's really important that you continue to monitor the intervention and measure the behavior as long as the intervention is in place. As long as it takes, somebody needs to be measuring that behavior on a regular basis. Then we need to think about how to fade the intervention. How do we know when the problem behavior is improving? Well, we've done some skill building and the academic skills have increased, or we see that the student isn't as off task and has increased time focusing on work, and then we see academic behaviors increasing. So we want to fade the intervention where the teacher is not as actively delivering the intervention, but we can't pick that until we know for sure that the behavior has improved. And we only know that by measuring. And then the last thing to think about here is, how often will results be shared and by whom? We have to think about who's delivering the intervention, who's measuring the intervention, and then who's sharing data. If I were a parent and I had a student with an IEP that needed behavioral goals, and I worked with the team for them to conduct a functional behavior assessment and an intervention plan, and those goals went to the IEP, I would want to be tracking the progress. Certainly not every day, but I would want to know, and probably your whole ARD team needs to know, probably on about a weekly basis, how is this intervention going? Do we need to make any adjustments? Is the intervention working as planned? If not, let's make adjustments. Because sometimes what you see is that you go through these couple steps, the classroom teacher's implementing the intervention, and then that's the last of it. So the classroom teacher isn't really sure when to fade the intervention, isn't really sure when to stop doing the intervention, because no one is checking back on the results and no one is checking back on the behavior. We need to know how the behavior is going. And when I say we need to know how the behavior is going, that means everybody at that ARD table during the functional behavior step and the behavioral intervention step. If you're at the table for those steps, then you need to see an update on the behavior progress on a regular basis, as long as the intervention is continuing. And so one of the things to think about here before I move on to our last step, which is pulling it all together in the IEP, is that if everybody comes into this process with these list of questions ready to answer, it really is a very collaborative effort. Sometimes the burden of some of these steps falls on the classroom teacher. Sometimes it falls on whoever's doing the training. Sometimes it may fall on a behavior specialist who's coming in. Sometimes it may fall on the special ed teacher that's providing the increased academic scaffolding and building of skills during that time. So I just want you all to know that going through these steps, it is a very, very collaborative effort. And going through these steps can be a little threatening to people because they feel like, oh, we're doing this because someone's afraid I'm not going to do my job. When we're talking about behavior change, it's not really about, are you doing your job? It's just about making a plan long-term and saying, here's our plan. Let's assign roles for this step, this step, this step, this step. Everyone's going to do their part. And we know that if we have someone watching, if we have a different person in charge of each step, we can bring it back together and then we're going to have effective behavior change. So just know that when you go into this, some ARD teams have this kind of collaboration already. Some ARD teams don't. But if we are really looking at finding lasting behavior change, we have to be accountable as a group to make sure all of these questions have been answered. So then we get to our last step, which is our IEP step. So our individualized education plan. With our student Jane, she already has an IEP and already has some academic goals. Because of our behavioral intervention plan, we're able to add some behavioral goals to go with those academic goals. So let's think about how we're going to periodically follow up with the teacher about accommodations recommended in the IEP. Or I could say about recommendations or strategies. So we're really going to think about these two questions. How do we know when the behavioral goal is met? And how has the success of the behavioral goal impacted Jane's academic? That should be academic skills. Sorry, I just probably stopped typing there. Academic skills or academic success. When we have an IEP, we typically meet once a year. And that really is due to the nature of IEP goals. Typically a classroom teacher, a general education teacher, and a special education teacher are going to get together and really work on the academic goals for a student. They're going to use assessments. They're going to use large assessments like standardized assessments. They're going to use smaller assessments like screening tools and sort of in the moment assessments to make those and create those academic goals. And those academic goals are often on the scale of a whole year. If Jane is in second grade, we know what the second grade TEACs are. We know, hopefully through our assessment, where Jane is in her progress toward the second grade TEACs. And then the purpose of our academic goals in the IEP is to move Jane from where she is to where she needs to be at the end of the year in relation to the TEACs. The problem with behavioral goals is that they don't work on a nice and neat yearly schedule. So when we say, how will we know that a behavioral goal is met? Chances are, if you start this FBA process in September, when you have the IEP meeting, and then you meet again the next September, you've missed a huge bit of information in the middle. Our behavioral goals may take 6 weeks to be met. They may take a semester. It may mean that they take 9 to 18 weeks over the school year because the teacher is teaching some skill building slowly. And then we get to the point where the academic part of the behavior is addressed. And then we see the problem behavior decreasing. But it's not on a yearly schedule. So typically when you're talking about behavioral goals, you have to meet and have an IEP meeting or an ARD meeting in the interim when you think that the behavior is improved. Because that classroom teacher is going to be implementing the intervention as long as it's in the IEP. So when the intervention is working and the intervention doesn't need to happen anymore, that's when you really need to have another ARD meeting to revise the behavioral goals. So I really can't state that enough. Behavioral goals don't work on a yearly basis. It's not okay to have a behavioral goal and then only revisit it once a year. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to the next few slides and then come back. And I would love to hear your thoughts on your experiences with FBAs and BIPs and any experiences that you have with IEPs that had behavioral goals. Also, at the same time, we're going to do discussion, we can do Q&A. So let me skip ahead to our resources. So here are a couple of resources that I found to be particularly helpful. As you, I'm sure, hopefully are aware that in Texas, we have these regional educational service centers. Region 13 created a series of free self-paced modules that are really interested. I have my, my undergraduate and graduate students go through these, and it's called Behavior is Communication. It's really talking about why does problem behavior happen and how do you get to the root or purpose or function of the problem behavior. And then another resource here is, it's called FBA to BIP. And so it's forms and resources. It's all sorts of blank forms that you can download and write in for all of those steps in the behavior intervention process. Of course, your district may have some forms you may want to use. Sometimes those forms are pretty brief and you might like something a little more extended. This is just a huge list of forms. It tells you what it is and you can click on it and download it. So very helpful. And then the last resource I have here is our special education full and individual initial evaluation timeline. I was just working with a family recently whose child was diagnosed with dyslexia. I'm a special education professional. I've worked in this field, but I pull out this kind of timeline when I'm working with folks who are not special education specialists, such as parents, and say, okay, well, just so you know, before we get to the IEP, here are our milestones and here's how long it's going to take. And sometimes having those milestones set out really gives parents a sense of how thoroughly you and your school are examining each step and how seriously you're taking each step. That's why it takes so long to do those pieces. Sometimes it's 30 days till the next step. Sometimes it's 45 days till the next milestone. It's just really good as both an education professional and as a parent to have that in front of you, to say, okay, really, what is our timeline here? Because we're talking about an agreed upon timeline. And then here are a couple of peer-reviewed or article-based references. If you are ever interested in looking at evidence-based interventions, so interventions based on best practice, this is where they come from. They come from research that people have done, and people typically do a research study with very tightly controlled parameters, just like what we discussed. What behavior are we measuring? Who's going to measure it? How long are they going to intervene? How do we know when it's working? How do we know when it's not working? And they write about it. So here are just a couple examples that I found that pertain to this topic. So I'm going to go back to these questions. And I want to go ahead and open it up to, I'll let you read these quickly or briefly, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see me. And I would love to know what questions you have, but also, do you have any experiences with behavioral goals in an IEP? Because it's not always easy. If it were easy, we wouldn't have to have all these trainings on this process. So I'm going to stop sharing now and come back.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. Just as a reminder, if you're joining us on Zoom, please put your questions for Dr. Hart in the Q&A. If you've got comments about what your experiences are, you can put those in the chat box. We'll be looking at both of those. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can put that in the comments and we'll catch those. So we do have a question. So if a student already has an IEP, and there's been a recommendation from a neuropsychologist to create a BIP, do you need to go back and start with that FBA in order to move forward, or do you just start with the BIP?
So that's a really good question. Our federal law and federal guidelines say that the purpose of the BIP is to create a function-based intervention. You can't really determine the function of the problem behavior without an FBA. So that's what the federal guidelines tell us. They tell us, yes, you have to do all three parts in that process. You must start with the functional behavior assessment, identify the behavior you're talking about, find out the purpose or the function, and then use that information to create the BIP, because the BIP is about intervention, and you cannot choose an intervention without knowing what the purpose is. So yes, you have to have all three steps, even though it's a bit laborious. But what it means is the intervention you choose in the BIP is going to have a much more likely chance of working because it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the results of your functional behavior assessment. So yes, you need both of those. You need the FBA and the BIP to go into the IEP goals as well. A follow-up question that some people have is, can I just put behavioral goals straight into the IEP? And the answer is no. If you need to set behavioral goals, you need to really follow that three-step process.
Excellent. Thank you for that. A couple of other questions. So should the team be tracking the replacement behavior, the problem behavior itself, or should they track both?
That is a really smart question. I like that. You should absolutely be tracking both. So what you're talking about with the replacement behavior is, so for those of you who are not familiar with the concept replacement behavior, you have a problem behavior and you determine the function, and then you choose a replacement behavior that's going to meet the same needs. So for example, if you have a student who is primarily nonverbal, and that student screams when they want your attention, that's the problem behavior. And the replacement behavior might be they walk over to you and hand you a card that says help. So you're choosing a behavior that meets the same needs. They both are behaviors that are geared towards getting your attention, but you have the inappropriate version and the appropriate version. The inappropriate version is screaming. The appropriate version is teaching the student to give you that card to ask for help. You absolutely want to measure both. And you should expect to see an inverse relationship as the inappropriate behavior decreases, as the appropriate behavior decreases. I'm sorry, I'm getting all backwards here. The more they ask for help using the card, the less they need to scream. So you will see that one goes up while one goes down, but you absolutely want to measure both to make sure you don't need to make any adjustments along the way. So great question.
Absolutely. All right, great question. We've got somebody that they're not getting good data from the school and asked what are some tips or some things they can do to get some better data on the goals for behavior?
So I would ask that person, is there already a BIP in place and you'd like to have more data from the BIP?
Yes, she did say that.
Good. Okay. So that's why I was really wanting to lay out collaboration steps from start to finish, because it can be really intimidating for either the parent or the school to come in the middle and say, okay, now tell me how you've been doing. I want to see your progress now. It feels like that the parent is checking up on the school, when in reality, that's not where the parent is coming from. And so that's why I really encourage our teams to adopt that collaborative model from start to finish, because when you have that collaborative model and you set it up from the beginning saying, okay, we're going to discuss each step and come to consensus on each step. Then when a parent comes back and says, I want to see some more data, two things happen. One, the team has already determined how data is to be shared, and there's already a mechanism in place. But two, the team has already taken that really open collaborative model. So when someone asks a pretty reasonable question, the team can roll with it and handle it and not feel like the school-based intervention team is under attack. So I would say for that, in that situation, maybe approaching or in the next ARD meeting, or even calling an IEP meeting or an ARD meeting, convening everybody and saying, okay, I really want to have a more collaborative approach. I would just like to know all the hard work you guys have been doing. And I just want to know more. I'm not, this isn't an accusation. I just want to know more. Can we have a quick status update right now so that you can catch me up on everything you've been doing? And then could I get some more data? So it's really giving the school a chance to shine and to show you all the hard work they're doing. That's one of the schools and teachers are not good at. We work our butts off. We work really hard in schools, and sometimes parents don't see that. And so it's hard for them to appreciate it because they don't see it. So if I were that parent, I would encourage that parent to reach out to whoever's in charge of the ARD process or the IEP meeting and say, can we have a meeting just so I can get a status update on all the good intervention you've been doing so far? Can you just catch me up to this point? And then moving forward, is there a way that I can keep hearing about the good progress that you're making? So there's a little bit of a sensitivity there in terms of how do I approach the school where they don't feel like I'm blaming them. You're really just asking for what they've already done. And if you can explain it that way, hopefully they will see it as not an attack. It's so easy for both sides to get very defensive about this process.
All right, we've got so many good questions. Another question, does a student have to have an IEP in order to have an FBA or a BIP?
So that's a really good question. So our federal law concerning education and concerning the IEP really revolves around special education students. And those 3 steps were put in place as accountability. So we wanted to say, okay, we have a student with special ed needs that has academic goals. We're not just going to dump these behavioral goals in. So the law mandates you have to do it systematically, and you have to proceed through these steps. So I would say the formal FBA and the formal BIP the law does not require an FBA and a BIP for a student who's not in special education. However, those steps and those processes of going through the FBA to determine the function of a behavior and choosing a function-based intervention, it's 2 things. It's based on federal law to meet those standards, but it also is based on really what we know about behavior change. So if I had a student in my class and I were a general education teacher, I would absolutely look at that FBA, anything I had access to in terms of what the district gives me for conducting FBAs and the BIPs, and say, okay, I have a student who isn't in special ed, so we don't have to formally submit each of those 3 steps along the way, but I would absolutely use the same process. You might use the same document. And that's where that one resource of FBA to BIP might come in. It could even give you some of those worksheets that you're going to work through if it's not something you use on a regular basis. So long story short, the tool focuses around behavior change. And if you want to really change a student's behavior, yes, I would use them. The law does not require it, and so you would not have to use them and submit them. But they're based on what we know about solid behavior change, so I would use them even though they're not required.
All right, we've got some questions where parents are wanting some clarity and just some ideas on how they can improve kind of the goals that their child may have. And so one parent asks, the problem behavior is mostly during unstructured time in the classroom. And so what could a good objective or goal be when we're looking at behavior issues that occur during unstructured time?
So that's a really good question. One of the things I found when I do behavioral consultations for both schools and families, a lot of times, and it's human nature, I absolutely do the same thing. we want to make a goal for the student because we see the student's behavior as a problem. But really, if we take a step back and look at it objectively, perhaps the goal needs to be for the adult in the room in terms of what they can do to make that problem behavior less likely to happen. So what I would say is if you see a common problem behavior during unstructured time, as a consultant, I would go in and my first question would be, show me exactly what happens during unstructured time. What does that mean? Is it unstructured meaning the student doesn't know what to do? And that's why behavior is happening, because the student is communicating, I don't know what to do, I'm uncomfortable, I like structure, but I'm not getting enough structure right now. Sometimes that's what that means. Sometimes it means something different. Sometimes it means a time when they're not being directly supervised by the teacher. Like for instance, during reading, if a teacher is working with a small group and other students are completing activities independently, you could call that unstructured. It's not really unstructured. Really what you mean is time when they're not directly interacting with the teacher. So I think the first thing I would say is probe the teacher a little bit and probe the IEP team and say, okay, what do you mean by unstructured time? What activities are you talking about? And then that's where you go into the can't versus won't. They don't want to do their work, or they can't do their work because they need a little bit more support. And I'd be willing to bet it's probably a can't. They need a little more support. They're communicating their frustration than they're acting out. So I would say probe into what they mean by unstructured time, because it can have many definitions.
Absolutely. Here's a great question. So for some parents that may be new to this, who is the person at the school district that would conduct the FBA?
So that is such a good question. When you started asking it, I thought you were going to say who's in charge of the IEPs and who's in charge of the ARD meetings, because that also varies. All of this varies. And so in a school district, various people can conduct FBAs. Schools usually like it for someone who's had a little bit of extra training, not necessarily advanced training, but a little bit of extra training. I've worked with school districts where the teachers conduct their own FBAs. I've worked in schools where they have the opposite extreme, where they have someone maybe from central office come in and observe and conduct an FBA. So part of it too is the role of the behavior specialist is really different in different schools. Sometimes the behavior specialist is someone at the district level that you don't really get to interact with very much. Sometimes it's someone in your school. And in some of our really small districts, we find that they'll even call their regional service center and have that person come in and conduct an FBA. So it really just depends on what is the setup in your district in terms of who conducts it. And it is tough. The farther away that person is from your school, two things: the less they're going to know about your school and your classroom, and the less time they probably have allocated to spend there for follow-up. And that's why you need to make sure you know who's collecting data, because if the district specialist isn't going to come once a week for 12 weeks, then who is keeping an eye on the store and who is collecting data? Because the classroom teacher is already doing the intervention, and we can only ask our classroom teachers to wear so many hats. So it's a little unclear. I'm sorry, it's not unclear, but it is, it's highly variable across districts who that would be. But I would ask the person who leads your IEP meetings or your ARD team and say, okay, in this district, if we needed an FBA, who would do it?
Excellent. So another question from parents. Their child has avoidant behavior and kind of tries to escape. And the goal is that they will complete the task within 1 minute. What are some ideas for kind of improving that goal and improving that outcome?
So I think the biggest thing I would want to know is, can they do the task? You want them to complete a task in 1 minute or whatever time 2 minutes or 5 minutes. What evidence do you have that they can do it? how do you know they can do it? And so that's really going back to the can't versus won't. They won't do it. Okay, so then you go the route of reinforcement, and you have all sorts of things you can put in place. You can do beat the clock. You can do earning stickers. If they can't do it, then they need some support, no matter how much they need. And I see someone that just typed in, a lot of it is won't. Yes, and so you might want to even need to figure out, why won't they do it? What is it? Are they afraid it's going to be too hard? Were they afraid they're going to struggle? Is it boring? Is it because 1 minute's such a short period of time? And I think it's so easy as adults for us to say, oh, come on, it's 1 minute. Like, why can't you just finish it? But you have to probe a little more, because won't is not a function. You have to think about, okay, they don't want to do it. Dig a little deeper. Why don't they want to do it? Have they already been working for 7 hours and you're asking them to do homework and they don't want to do it there? Well, I wouldn't want to do that either. So just thinking about what is that won't is not a function. You have to probe them a little more to figure out what the function is, and then pick a solution. Maybe they need more breaks. Maybe they need a bigger break between schoolwork and homework, just as an example. But you've got to really get to that purpose.
Excellent. We're right at 1:15. So as we're wrapping up, I want to share one comment with you, Dr. Hart. We had a parent in the chat say that their daughter was recently diagnosed and has just completed the FBA, and tomorrow is the IEP meeting to go over all of that. And she wanted you to know that she is feeling better with going into that meeting with the information that she has from you. So thank you for sharing and for joining us today. It was wonderful to learn from you and to hear all of those wonderful thoughts, ideas, and information to help us have FBAs and BIPs that work for our students. So thank you again for joining us, Dr. Hart. It was a pleasure to have you. And as we're wrapping up, I'm going to share my screen and wrap us up today. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. And thank you again, Dr. Hart, for coming and sharing with us. The recording for today's webinar will be available on our website at prntexas.org and also on our Facebook page. If you're needing a certificate of attendance, you will be receiving an email to thank you for joining the webinar. You can follow the link in that email and get your certificate of attendance. This webinar wrapped up our fall lineup of webinars. And so be sure and check out our website and our Facebook page for information for our webinars that will be starting up again in January. On the screen is contact information for our Director of Statewide Services, Christina, our support specialist, Chelsea, and myself. Please be sure and check out our website for any upcoming information in your regions, as well as a lot of information available to you as parents. You can also like and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter at PRN Texas. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Hart. It was such a pleasure to have you join us, and it was so nice to see you again and get to learn from you. And thank you all, and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Dr. Hart.
Thank you so much. I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
We will. And Dr. Hart, what you sent us was your draft. So what you sent us right before the webinar was another copy of the draft of your
sorry.
PowerPoint. If you want to send me the final, we will upload
Yes.
that on our website so everybody can access that as well.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you noticed that.
Yes,
And
thank
at
you
the very
so much.
end, I do have contact information on that last slide.
Okay.
And so your folks are welcome to contact me if they have any questions.
Wonderful. All right, we will. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you join us again.
Thank you.
So,
Hey,
thank
Stephanie,
you.
you want to end the Facebook Live?
Let me